So this is the time we dismiss for Faith City. If you're going to Faith City, now is the time. We hope y'all have a great worship time. Also, I want to introduce some new members this morning. Melissa, if we could have that slide. This is the Campbell family, Kevin, Christina, and Cannon, who may have just gone out for children's worship. Are y'all in here? She's right here. They have placed membership with us. We are so glad they're here. Let's acknowledge them and welcome them. Super excited about that. So we started a sermon series a couple weeks ago, but in some ways, the genesis of this goes back for several months. Sorry, my microphone is falling off. All right. So we've actually been talking about this topic for several months, and I kind of want to go back and catch you up on what we've been doing so you can see how it's fed in to what we are currently doing. We started out a couple months ago on a series called The God of Relationships. And, I don't expect you to remember everything from that series, but the one takeaway I hope everyone got from that series is that God is an invitational God. The God revealed by Jesus is invitational and not coercive at all, but invites us into the story. And then we went into our Christmas series called The Arrival, which we talked a lot about the arrival of Jesus on the scene and the incarnation and the birth of Christ and what that meant. And remember, we went through these words of hope and peace and joy and love. And not only is God an invitational God, but God invites us into the story by sending his own son into the story. And we start to experience what that means. And I think it's a good thing for us to consider sometimes, because I think growing up, I felt like Christianity, and I grew up in church, I feel like Christianity was presented to me, or I somehow took it to mean, here's all the things you're not allowed to do. Here's a list of things, and that God created us and created all these things, and if you'll be careful and not do these certain things, then maybe you'll be good enough to go to heaven one day. And it was, some of you are old enough to remember the old saying, don't drink, don't cuss, don't chew, don't hang out with girls who do. That was and I'm not sure that's exactly how it was presented, but in my pre-adolescent, non-formed frontal lobe, that's what I took from my church experience. That it's about all the things you're not supposed to do. We spent too much time talking about why we shouldn't be a part of the world, and not near enough time talking about why we should be a part of the kingdom. And that kingdom is full of hope and peace and joy and love. And there's real reasons to be part of the kingdom. And Jesus embodied that when he came onto this earth and started living that out. So not only is God invitational, but God invites us into the story through Jesus coming into the story, the Son of God coming into the story and embodying all these beautiful things that we can grab a hold of now. It's not about what we're not supposed to do. It's about what we can do when we're in the kingdom of God. And then 2 weeks ago, Joel started a series called Built by Welcome. And the idea behind this is not only is God an invitational God, and he invites us into the story, but we start to embody the ethos of Christ when we become invitational. And it reminds me of a video I saw a few years ago. Some of you will know who this is. This is Penn Jillette. He is half of the comedy and magic duo Penn and Teller. Have you seen these guys? You know who I'm talking about? It's interesting. They're super funny, and his partner Teller never talks, and it's a cool thing to watch. And they go all over the country doing this thing together, and they were performing one night, and there's a video where he's talking about, Penn Jillette is talking about this night when they were performing together, and a businessman, after the show, who was still dressed in his suit from work, came up to him And he said he was kind of sheepish in the way he came up to him. He was kind of almost like he was intimidated, but he came up and he said, "Hey, I loved the show. I think you are super funny. I think you are really cool. Thank you for doing the show." And of course, Gillette was magnanimous and said, "Thank you for saying so." And then he said, "Yeah, I feel a little awkward doing this, but I just feel led to do it." And he handed him a copy of the New Testament. And he said, "I'm going to give you this. I wrote my number in the front of the book. And if you have any questions about this, feel free to call me anytime. I'll take the call." And then he kind of just sheepishly walked away. Well, the interesting thing about that interaction is Penn Jillette is a hard atheist. He's super atheist, antagonistic towards religion. And so as I was watching the video, and I would love to show you the video, but he also has a potty mouth and didn't think it'd be appropriate for church. But in the video, you expect him to just bash this Christian who came up to him and handed him this Bible. But he had almost exact opposite of the reaction. As a matter of fact, he was so impressed with this guy's humility and kindness and the way he presented it, that he said, even though I don't believe, it's hard not to be impressed with this person. And then he said this quote, and I want to give you the quote, but he uses a word that we don't often use. It's the word proselytize. And if you don't know what that means, it's kind of he was using it as a more pejorative way of saying evangelize. And so that's where that word belongs in here. And I thought this quote was super interesting. I pulled it right from the video. He says, "If you believe there's a heaven and a hell, and people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life, how much do you have to hate someone not to proselytize? How much do you have to hate somebody to believe in everlasting life is possible and not tell them that?" And as I was watching that video, I was so challenged by that because I hadn't thought about it that way. And sometimes it takes hearing someone who disagrees with you explain the way through it for you to catch it. And I'm not saying that you hate everyone that you haven't invited to church. I'm just saying there's a perspective of this topic that someone who's not a part of our community has that I think will be helpful for us to know how some people think through this whole issue. As Joel pointed out, we are called to go. We don't necessarily wait for people to come walk through our doors, but our challenge is to be fully Christian in the way we introduce ourselves to the world and the way we invite people into this community, and that it's our job is to go and not just let the world come to us, that we embody the invitational God, that we take up the characteristics of Jesus and invite everyone into this story and this community. And then last week, Dino came. And if you were here last week to hear Dino Roussos preach, he's our missionary in Greece, then you too were blessed by that. And when we had Joel and I had already planned this series before we knew Dino was coming, and Joel very graciously gave up one of his Sundays so Dino could preach. And I have to tell you, it's the first time I met him. I was just so blessed by him. And here's again someone who embodies this invitational God. And he told the story about in their church in Greece where they have 8 services in 5 different languages, which is so cool. And he came to our life group, and Olga, who's also in our life group, and I didn't know she spoke Russian until I heard her and Dino start talking Russian to each other. And I thought it was so cool to watch him interact with her, and it made me feel, I don't know if it's the right word, it made me feel proud that we're supporting someone like Dino in that place. That we have the connection to a church in Greece that's reaching out to so many people. And it's, again, just an example how this thing that we're doing is built by welcome. That we want to welcome people into the kingdom, and we want to have a global view of that. And it was so good to have him in here. And if we're going to be a church that's built, it will always be built by welcome. Matter of fact, every church is built by welcome, by invitation, by inviting someone in. And you may be thinking, well, I grew up in church, so I'm not here because someone invited me. And that's not exactly true. And let me show you how and why that's not exactly true. One, your family, when they made you come or took you to church when you were a kid, that was them inviting you. But even before that, if you trace it back all the way, generation to generation to generation to generation, at some point, there was someone who was invited to church, who was invited to be a part of the story of God and be part of a community. And I remember as a kid, my grandparents telling me how they came to be part of a church. And it was from two different directions. And from my grandmother, it was her dad who was invited to church. My great-grandfather, his name was Oscar Holliday. For my grandfather, it was my grandmother that invited him to church. And he was so encouraged by a loving community that's why he became a Christian. And so no matter how you think about why you're here this morning, if you go back and look, you are here because someone welcomed someone into a church at some point. And you also can be part of that story. Every church is built on welcome. And it really is something that we do as members of the body of Christ. And I say that because I can't invite your friends to church. I can if I meet them, if you introduce me to them, but for the most part, it's you that invites your friends to church. The elders can't invite your friends to be a part of our church. That if the church grows and welcomes people into our body, it's because friends invite friends to church. And so it's all of us. It's not just one of us. It's all of us that has this job to grow and build the church. Joel was right. We can't wait for the world to come to us. We can't. We need to be out in the community and being fully embodied followers of Jesus in the community. We must go. We must invite. But if we do it well, eventually people walk through the doors of our place. And then what happens? What happens after that? What happens when people come in? And it goes back to Joel's original question that he started off with, and I think it's kind of the true north of this whole series. What kind of church are we becoming? What kind of church are we becoming? Now, I want to make a little bit of a disclaimer. It always feels a little weird talking about how we treat visitors when I know we have some visitors in the room. And I always feel like, if I do my job well this morning, you're going to be really nice to those visitors who are around you, and that might be a little overwhelming if everybody's nice at once. And so I just want to say that disclaimer, and sometimes, we want to be welcoming to visitors. Sometimes we don't even know each other very well. I remember it was several years ago, I asked someone if they were a visitor and introduced myself, and they said, no, I've been coming here for 30 years. And I was like, oh, and luckily it was after COVID because I was like, you look a lot different without the mask. And so we want to take advantage of things like our Sunday school classes and our life groups and the things we do to help the community to bond us together and make sure we even know each other. But I think if you grew up in church and grew up in a church culture, I don't think sometimes we fully understand how difficult it is to walk into a church for the first time. It's not always easy, and especially if you have some sort of trauma, family trauma or trauma dealing with church or feeling judged or feeling less than as a part of your church experience. I don't think, if we've been here a lot, I don't think we always realize that. There's a lot of you know I'm a huge music fan. There's a rock duo named 21 Pilots that some of the kids in my youth group in Memphis got me listening to. It's not really my kind of music, but as I listened to them, I loved the lyrics. And I was listening to a song that they wrote called Heathens. And the more I listened to it, the more I was convinced it was about their church experience or some kind of church experience. And so when you read the lyrics of the song, it's about how the lead singer, the writer of the song, is embarrassed sometimes to bring his friends to church. And it's actually advice he's given to the church to how to treat them when he invites them. And the song starts out with these words: all my friends are heathens, Take it slow. Wait for them to ask you who you know. Please don't make any sudden moves. You don't know half of the abuse. And I've heard him interviewed, and he's been very hesitant to talk about his faith and his life as a Christian, the lead singer has. But when in the interview, he said that anytime someone comes in new to a group and they feel any kind of judgmentalism or cliquishness within the group, that it has a devastating impact on them. And I thought that insight was so interesting because we don't understand the stories of the people who come in. We don't even understand all of our own stories sometimes. We don't know the baggage people bring into this room with them. And so I think we need to be careful with each other. We want to be a place of healing, a place that helps people heal and doesn't hurt people. I was talking to some skateboarders out here. I don't know if you know this, but our parking lot is very popular among skateboarders sometimes. It has to do with that ledge that's right out there that's just the perfect height to do it. And so I was out here, and they said, "Are you going to kick us out of here?" And I said, "Nah, I don't think I am." But I said, "I would appreciate it if you didn't sue us, if you fall and break your face." But one of them seemed really friendly, and so I just invited him to church. And he said, "Oh, I have a church. I go to church every Sunday." And I said, "Oh, that's awesome. Do your friends go to church with you?" And he said something that stayed with me for a long time. He said, "I would never invite my friends to church." I said, "Why?" And he goes, I don't know how they'd be treated." And we talked a long time about how society's not always welcoming of skateboarders. There's some reasons for that. It's a different sermon. But I think it's interesting that even this kid, and I say kid, he may have been in his 20s, even he who went to church had the assumption of judgment. This is a guy who goes to church, and he still had the assumption that church is a judgmental place. And I think it's interesting because I've heard people say, I don't know if I want to invite my friends to church. And that's such a difficult thing, and it's such a dangerous commentary on the church when we don't even want to invite our friends. And so I think we need to think through how we welcome and love on people and what that looks like. In God's message to the early church that Dan did a beautiful job of reading, James takes issues with this idea of selective hospitality. Where someone comes in, and if they look like us, we're super welcoming, and if they don't look like us, we don't welcome them off. They look like they have some money, we give them important seats, but if they look like they're just right off the streets, we're a little wary of them. And he's speaking into that situation, and this idea that we all have a tendency to gravitate to the people who are most like us. And James is saying, as a church community, be very careful about that. Be very careful about how we judge people who don't always look at us. And sometimes the lack of intentional effort, we gravitate towards cliques and cliquishness and don't always see that there are people who feel left out of a group. And this can be devastating in a church, especially for visitors, but just in general. And so we want people to have an experience of what it's like not to be judged. And sometimes we do it to each other. Steve and Goad, who I think did communion a couple weeks ago, made a joke about me telling him to take off his hat. For the record, I didn't tell him to take off his hat. He was joking. He will acknowledge that. I did make a comment about his hat. But it reminded me of a story. I had a kid in the youth group in West Virginia. His name was Tim, and it was a really interesting situation. This is back when we used to pass the communion, where we had the table up front, and people would come up and stand up, and you either had the arms in the front stance or the arms in the back stance when you were up front. You know what I'm talking about? And they would pass out the trays to everyone. And Tim noticed that they were a person down passing out the trays. So he just jumped up to help. seeing that they were missing someone. Well, he forgot to take off his hat. And so passed a communion trays out wearing his hat the whole time. And a lady came up to me afterwards and said, if someone wears a hat during communion again, I'm going to leave this church. And I prayed, God, help me be kind right now. Because I have to admit, I was tempted not to be kind. And I just tried to explain, hey, he just forgot. I'll talk to him about it. It's whatever. What I didn't take the time to explain was that young man whose mom was struggling with severe depression, got up that morning, like he did every Sunday morning, and made his mom breakfast. And then got dressed, got in the car, drove a couple miles, picked up his grandmother who couldn't drive, and drove her to church. And here was a young man at 16 years old whose family should have been taking care of him, and he was taking care of them instead. And still got to church on time and was so aware and responsible for things going well in our church that he noticed someone was missing and he filled the spot without even thinking about it. I don't think I'm going to get too mad that he forgot to take off his hat. But it shows you how entwined we get with how we feel about what's supposed to happen in general, and we don't know the stories that brought us here. We don't know everything that we've gone through. And Steve, if you want to wear your hat, I'm not going to be mad at you. But here's the deal. James says this is especially true when it's wealth disparity. And the interesting thing to me is he doesn't make any bones about it. He doesn't say, hey, when you show this kind of discrimination, it's not good. He says it's a sin. It goes against the royal law of God when we show discrimination. And so I think we have to be careful. We have to remember and understand that everyone we meet is the image bearer of God. That God made us in his own image, and everyone we meet is the image bearer of God. Everyone we like, love, dislike, hate, however we feel about anyone else, we sometimes need to be reminded they are the image bearer of God. And because of that, because of what God has done for us, we treat people with the same hospitality, the same depth of love that we've been shown, and we remember that every single one of us, if we've been here for 20 minutes or 20 years, is here because of the loving grace of God shown in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We are all in need of mercy. We are all in need of grace. Peter says it this way in 1 Peter. I love this passage. This is 1 Peter 4, verses 8 through 10. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. That we embody the grace of God in its various forms when we love each other and show hospitality to one another. In other words, hospitality is worship. Hospitality is the way we worship. It's as much worship as when we sing or say prayers or anything else we do as a part of this worshiping community. Hospitality is a part of that. 2 weeks ago, Joel gave us this acronym. It's the acronym for BLESS. It is begin with prayer. And I hope you're already doing that. I hope you're praying about the people that you would like to invite and connect to a church fellowship. Listen to our neighbors, eat together at table, serve the people we meet, and then serve with the people we meet, and then share your story. Share how you became a part of a church community and how you came to know Jesus. And I think if we can interact with these things, then God will start to bless us by showing us the right people and who we need to have the conversations with. And so when you talk about hospitality in this context, I want to define exactly what I'm talking about. Hospitality is making space for others in your own heart. And collectively, our hospitality is making space for others in our community. Not just physical space, but space in our own hearts for the people who come and worship with us. I think one of the ways you can do this is like a hospitality sandwich. Actually, I don't know that it's hospitality. You always call the sandwich the thing in the middle, not the thing on the bread. You know, you never have a bread sandwich, you have a ham sandwich. But I'm talking about the hospitality being the bread, that we sandwich people in. So, in other words, we invite people to eat in our homes. That's hospitality. We invite them to church, and then they feel welcome and a part of our church, that we wrap them in hospitality. And if they never come or they find another church, we celebrate their journey with them as we go along. That we are so hospitable that we just want to make space for their story in our lives. And whatever that looks like, that ends up looking that way. And I think to do that, I think part of it is a mindset change. And one of the things when I first interviewed for this position at this church, one of the things that drew me to this church was the lobby. We have a big, expansive lobby. People, we have a hard time starting church because so many people are in the lobby, still talking. We love the lobby and the cafe and the playground and these spaces that feel like home, where family lives. My grandparents had a huge impact on me. They had a huge impact on me. And my grandparents were Southern family. Both of my grandparents were from Tennessee. My grandfather from East Tennessee and my grandmother from West Tennessee. So different, but the same. And in their house, both houses that they had, they lived in Knoxville, Tennessee until I was 18, and then they moved to Gallatin, Tennessee, and lived there until they passed. And in both of those homes, they had two different rooms that served the same function. They had a formal dining room. And the formal dining room is where we ate when we were trying to be fancy. It's where we ate when visitors were coming over. And that's it. It had the nicer, beautiful, old antique table. My grandmother pulled out the really nice dishes or the china. We had the crystal glasses that I was deathly afraid that I was going to break one of because I was always a klutz. We had to dress up a little more when we sat at that table. We had to act a little more informally or more formally, and it was just it was kind of a fancier setting. But then we had the kitchen table. They always had a table in their kitchen as well. And at the kitchen table, it was less formal. That's where we used the plastic cups. That's where we used the plastic plates. That's where, if we were going to play games, we played games at the kitchen table. We didn't have to dress up. We didn't have to be careful. If you spilled something, it was funny, not serious. It was a whole different vibe. And I think sometimes we've looked at our church experience more as the formal dining room and not enough like the kitchen table. And what we want to say is this place is about family. It's about a place where it's okay to mess up. It's okay if your phone goes off. It's okay if your baby cries. We're family in here, and this isn't the formal dining room. This is the kitchen table. I was talking to one of my friends recently, and she said she really hadn't gone to church since her children were born. She had her first child in the middle of COVID, and she really hadn't gone to church much since COVID. She and her husband, and as I was talking to her, she said, "Yeah, she knows I'm a pastor." I was, I knew her for 2 years before she realized what I did for a living, and so she actually said to me, "Hey, I went back to church a couple weeks ago," and I said, "How did it go?" She goes, "It wasn't great." I said, "What happened?" And she said that she and I think it was her sister and her sister's husband, and they were all there together, and one of the babies started crying. And the minister stopped in the middle of the sermon and said, we have a cry room over here. If your baby's crying, feel free to go and be in that cry room. And so I asked, was he just trying to be helpful? And she said, no. And I thought, that's so sad. And I even said to her, that wouldn't happen at the church I work with. And I invited her to our church. I said, that wouldn't happen there. So we have a cry room. We have children's worship, but none of it's mandatory. That we want our place to feel like family. We want it to feel open where everyone feels invited. And in some ways, I think we can learn a lot from our friends at Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know how well you know AA, but I think there's a lot we can learn from AA. AA, if you're not familiar with it, has found this perfect balance between everyone feeling loved, but also accountability within their system. And the way they love each other and sponsor each other is great. Now, I want to read this quote from someone from AA. I'm not going to tell you who it is because the last A stands for anonymous. And so, but I want to read the quote because I think it's interesting. It's an interesting take on church and how they see it from their perspective. They said this: when I'm late to church, people turn around and stare at me with frowns of disapproval. I get the clear message that I'm not as responsible as they are. When I'm late for AA, the meeting comes to a halt, and everyone jumps up to hug and welcome me. They realize that my lateness may be a sign that I almost didn't make it. When I show up, it proves that my desperate need for them won out over my desperate need for alcohol. Do you catch that? Do you catch what they're trying to say? That when we will allow space for other people, we acknowledge that it may not have been easy for them to get there. It may not have been easy for some of us to get here this morning. And so I want to say this officially. If you're visiting, we are so glad that you're here. If you're not visiting, we are so glad that you're here. If you're watching online, we are so glad that you're watching online. And we want you to be a part of us. And for our teens that are traveling, we're so glad that they had a place where they can go to learn more about God, to get closer to God, and to each other. We want to make space for everybody's experience. We're not a perfect church. We're not a perfect church. But if you ask what kind of church we're becoming, I hope we're becoming the kind of church that makes space for everyone. I hope we're becoming the kind of church that embodies the peace and joy and hope and love of the story of Jesus. I hope we're a church that loves God and loves each other well. I hope that's the kind of church that we're becoming. I hope you'll allow me to revert, to go back to be my old history teacher self for just a second. This is Martin Luther King Jr.'s weekend. Tomorrow, a lot of us will have the day off because of that. And some of you are old enough to have grown up during civil rights, and some of us were not. But the one thing is I look back on it with a kind of historical perspective, and especially as a member of the church. One of the things that I look back on is how that there were Christians on both sides of the issue. And how, if you look at some of the atrocities that were committed against other people, it was occasionally Christians who were involved in both the perpetuation and the receiving of those atrocities. And I hope as a society we've gotten better, but I'm not always convinced we have. And I want to say that kind of the magic sauce for someone to assess how we're going to treat them is how we treat each other. Like, I don't get to be a visitor at a church very often. It's because I work on Sundays. But if I were a visitor in a church and I was trying to find a church, I think I would pay as much attention to how that church treated each other as I do how they treated me. Because that foreshadows how they will treat me if I ever become a member. And so this morning, I want to challenge us to do as James instructed us all those years ago. That when we see people, we don't notice how they're dressed as quickly as we notice who they are. And to find if they look like us or don't look like us, if they're in our age group or out of our age group, if they look like they've been to church a million times or never been to church once, that we find space for them in our hearts, and we find space for them in this place. Let's pray. Father, thank you for loving us and for the way you have invited us into your kingdom. I pray that we will be about inviting others into the kingdom as well. It's the name of your holy Son, I pray. Amen. This morning we're going to have a time of worship and prayer. We'll have some of our shepherds around the room that would love to pray with you. You can pray with each other if you'd like. If you want to become a Christian, there's always that opportunity to do that, and you can ask one of our elders how to do that as well. And whatever you need, we are here as together we stand and sing.